Hello everyone, this is Anne from Lolli and Grace, and I want to say welcome to this tutorial for the One Meaningful Word number 4 design. And I am going to make this really quick because nobody wants to hear me prattle on, and I know we just want to get to the stitching. So because of that, I am not going to be covering in this video how to wrap the hoop or stretch the fabric in the hoop or how to transfer the pattern onto the fabric. I've done that before in previous videos, but this one, all that information is contained in the instructions with lots of photos and lots of good, clear explanations. But I'm also, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer any questions. If you want to message me or get a hold of me on Instagram, I'm always happy to answer questions. So if you need any help with that, just let me know. But there's a lot of stitching to do on this one, and so I want to get right to that. And then at the end of the video, I will also show you how to mount this design onto a board for framing into, so you can pop it into an 8x10 frame. All right, so because there's so much to do, let's get right to it. I am going to start this piece by stitching the roses, and I'm showing you here the biggest rose. Now I do get a lot of questions, or I see a lot of questions from stitchers, particularly newer stitchers, who are wondering how do you know which area to stitch first. And on this pattern, generally it doesn't really matter. If I wanted to do the blue flowers first, I could have done those. But it doesn't really matter. There is one place where it does matter, and that is going to be the border that's going around this rectangle that goes around the word, because the little stitch I'm going to use has kind of a looped feature, and I want it to sit on top of the stitches for these flowers that look like they go up underneath the rectangle. So, but otherwise, if you want to start with a different flower, that's fine, or one of the leaves, doesn't matter. But I'm starting with the big rose. First thing to do is to make some French knots in the center. Now I'm using 3 strands of the darker gold thread. I believe it's 3852. Let me look. Yes, that is it. And I'm using 3 strands, and I'm not going to give you a whole long French knot tutorial because I've got that in some other places, but essentially you bring the thread up, you wrap it a number of times. I'm going to go 2 times, go back down into the fabric right next to where you came up, and pull slowly, holding that thread as you go so it doesn't snag into a knot that's not supposed to be there. Let me do that again for you. Make one right next to it, come up through the fabric, hold that thread, wind it around 2 times. I'm not choking up too much. I'm not making those wraps too tight, but I'm also not letting them be too loose. I'm going to put the needle down right next to where I came up. I'm going to slide those loops down towards the fabric. Pull the needle through, holding that thread. And there we go. So I'm going to do, let me see, I think I want to mix the dark gold and the light gold. So let me put this one aside for just a moment. I have the light gold, light yellow. This is 3 strands again. I believe it's 3822. I'm going to make a knot nestled up right next to those. And let me see, I think I want, those, I just want a little bit of variation down there. I may make a light colored one right. No, you know what? I'm going to make another light one. I'm going to make a smaller one. I'm going to just wrap it once, so it's kind of tucked up under there. And maybe one more light colored one. Wrap it once. And I think I'm going to bring my dark gold thread back up and make one more knot right here. Oh, there it goes. 1, 2, and go down. All right, so that's the center of my rose. I have kind of a dark shadow side and then the lighter side. So let me go knot these threads, snip them off so they're not in my way, and we will come back and start on this fun spiral section. The spiral section of the roses is really interesting and unique. It uses a technique called couching, which is a very common technique and one I've used a lot. Couching is when you take one thread, and let me get a dark thread that you can see. Hang on one second. All right, so you take a dark thread that you lay on top of the fabric, and then you take another thread that comes up through the fabric and goes over the thread that is laying on top of the fabric. So you're couching the surface thread with a thread that goes underneath and over and up and down. So that's what I'm doing here, but instead of using a thread, I am going to be using yarn. And not just one piece of yarn, but for parts of it, multiple pieces of yarn. So this is just a really inexpensive yarn I had here for a different project. I believe it's like a medium weight, sometimes called a medium weight on those labels, but I believe it's like a worsted weight yarn. You can use any color really, but I have white and I like that. It doesn't really matter because you're going to completely cover it up. And you're going to need to use the larger needle. I believe it is a number 20 embroidery needle. Don't quote me on that. I forgot exactly which one it is, but it's much larger, so it has a larger eye to accommodate this thick yarn. Now, to thread a thick piece of yarn like this through this eye, I'll show you a little trick. You can sort of squish out the fibers and then wrap them around, just fold them over the eye. Get them as flat as you can get them. In fact, I'm going to spread them out just a little bit more so they're not all bunched up. So see how that's kind of flattened out? I'm going to fold it over the eye, pinch it really hard, slide it off, and then pinch it as hard as I can between my fingers, and then I'm going to press that eye over that folded edge of yarn. Now I'm going to be honest. Depending on how thick your yarn is, that might work. This yarn is really tricky to have that happen, so I'm just going to cheat and use my trusty needle threader that I use to thread every single needle that I put thread on, and I'm just going to pull it through. And because that eye is really big, that big thick yarn will go right through. Put just a simple knot in the other end of the yarn. It's going to be a big knot. I will trim that knot very close, trim the tail off so that doesn't have a long tail, which will get caught. If I left a long tail and it's on the back of my work, as I'm pulling another needle through, the thread will pull those fibers up, and I don't like that when that happens. So there is my first piece of yarn that has a knot in the end on my big needle, and I'm going to come up right next to, or in other words, the very beginning of this spiral where it's really small right there. Come up right there, bring that yarn up, kind of have to tug a little bit to get that thick yarn through the fabric, pull it all the way through until the knot comes up against the back. Now I am going to go ahead and take my needle off of this yarn because I don't need it for a while, and I will use it again in just a minute for another piece of yarn. So I'm going to just let that hang for the moment. The next thing I'm going to do is the thread that I'm going to couch this yarn with is, I believe I'm going to start out with the kind of medium pink variegated yarn. This is that beautiful Threadworks overdyed floss. You can see when it's still on the skein, or still before you've pulled it apart, how pretty it is. See that? So I have 3 strands on my number 24 chenille needle, the one that I use for all of my regular stitching. This is just my basic needle, my basic go-to needle for everything, because it holds any number of strands from 1 to, and in fact it will hold 6 strands, but right here I'm using 3 strands. And now I'm going to begin to couch this thick yarn in a spiral around the French knots. So what I'm going to do is come up right up next to that yarn. So now as I work my way around, I'll kind of use my left hand to sort of direct the yarn. But now what I'm going to do for right now, I'm going to sort of pull it out of the way, and I'm going to go over. I came up on this side of the yarn, and now I'm going to go down on the other side of the yarn. Take it down. Hope I don't get a knot on the very first stitch. Okay, so that was my first couching stitch. I will come again and come on the outside. In other words, when I say outside, I mean the outside edge of the spiral. Come up and sort of pull that yarn over. So I'm now going down on the other side of the yarn. And right here at the very beginning, where it's really tiny, you don't want to pull your thread for any of this super, super tight. Generally speaking. I'll explain that a little bit later. But you can see now I'm starting to see a little bit of that thread building up. I like to work from the outside edge of the yarn, the spiral, because, and I've pulled my thread through. Here we go. Oh, and I have a big huge knot. Ooh, of course. Let me see. Oh, wait, maybe. All right, it worked itself out. Because as I am going up and over the yarn, I want to work from the outside of the spiral to the inside because I'm going to have to sort of fan those stitches. Let me get a sheet of paper and I will draw that quickly so I can explain it to you. So here is a drawing of this rose. And here's the spiral that I'm going to be working around. And so what I'm trying to convey is that as you are stitching over the spiral, start on the outside edge and go over towards the center and then come next to it. And this is going to be kind of like a satin stitch because the stitches are going to be very close together so that they completely cover. Let me zoom in a little bit. So they completely cover that yarn. And so you're going to have to place these stitches on the outside edge right next to each other. And when you come to the inside edge, they'll need to be squished together a little bit more. So in other words, you're doing a fan. Let me come over here and I will show what I'm talking about. In other words, a fan like this as you work around. So see how these stitches are a little bit further apart and these are close together. And so on the real thing, obviously they're not going to be that far apart. They're going to be right up next to each other, so you are covering the entire, all of the yarn. So you don't want to see any of the fibers of that yarn. If you are a person who, when they satin stitch, they jump ahead and like if this is your shape, and you do a stitch here, and a stitch here, and a stitch here, and then you come back in and fill in. You cannot do that with these variegated threads because you don't want to have one color. I'll show you another spot. You don't want to have, this is your shape, you don't want to have one color over here, and a color here, and a color here, and then you want to go all the way consecutive stitches so that the gradual changes of the color will show up as you work your way across. I just want to let you know that because some people I know like to jump ahead, add a few stitches, and then fill in when they satin stitch. These stitches you just want to work one right next to the other. So let's get back to the actual stitching. Get my pink thread again. So now I'm going to hold that up there. I'm going to keep working around the spiral. These threads want to knot up just a little bit, so I'm going to go a little bit slower as I pull them through. And when it's really tiny here, you can pull the thread, the pink thread, a little bit tighter because you want to compress that yarn. So as I'm here, I can pull, when I pull the thread down into the fabric, I can pull on it a little bit tighter to make that yarn smaller. As I work my way around, like maybe when I get to over here, like right here, and maybe up here, it's wider from here to here, so I'm going to be very gentle about how I pull that pink thread over the top of the yarn. I'm not going to yank on it really hard. I'm going to let it sit very gently on top of the yarn. So let me keep stitching, and I will speed it up so you can see this as it works its way around. And I'll come back in here when I get over to about over in here, because I want to show you how to add in the next piece of yarn. So I think you can see I have started to see those really pretty, beautiful shades of pink changing. It was darker right here and lighter right here. That's what's really fun about variegated threads, when those colors start to change. But you can also see on the pattern here that if I pull this back, you can see now that whereas this was a sort of a narrow section of the spiral, this section widens out. So what I'm going to do there is I am going to bring up another strand of yarn. So let me quickly get one threaded on my needle. Here you go. Put a knot in it. Okay, there's my second piece of yarn on the needle, and I'm going to come up, bring that second yarn right here, just where that pattern goes from really narrow and starts to widen out. So I'm going to come right up almost underneath that first piece of yarn. I don't want it to be far away. Make sure I pulled it all the way through. All right, I'm going to take the needle off of that one. So now I have two pieces of yarn that I will begin couching over, just like I was working on it before, but now instead of going over one, I'm going to go over two. So my next pink stitch, you kind of have to get that knot from the yarn out of your way a little bit on the back. Find the right place to come up. See, I pulled up some of the fibers from the yarn, the knot on the yarn. Okay. So I've kind of gotten that situated on the back. So now I'm going to stitch over two pieces of yarn. And this is the part where you need to start being a little more, even more mindful of how, okay, thread, come on, behave. Get this thread to not knot up on me. All right, of how much you pull on the thread underneath, so that you are not, because you want the yarn you want the yarn to give you a nice wide line, and you don't want to compress it so much here where the pattern says it should be wide. You want it to stay raised up, right? So as I work my way around, I am not going to pull my pink threads really, really tightly. I do want them to lay down flat, though. They're not quite behaving at the moment, but I'll get it to work. Come on the outside, and sometimes you have to find a place where your needle will let you go down. So what's happening here is my pink thread, as I pull it down, each of the three strands, one of them is kind of sticking up, and it's bothering me. And usually what I do is I pull it from the back, but because I don't want to pull these threads so tightly, I'm going to let it's really hard to show you this, I can't show you on the video. I'm going to let my thread on the back of my hoop hang down and untwist. Sometimes as you are doing repeated stitches, your thread wants to twist up on itself, and it kind of gets the strands out of alignment. So let's see if that has helped. Maybe they'll lay a little bit. Yeah, that worked. So I think you can also see that when I bring the needle up on outside of the yarn, I'm pulling the thread this way so I can see my line. See, right there is where I want to come up, so I'm pulling it up so I can see it there. And then I pull it this way a little bit so it's out of my way, because I do not want to take the needle and I don't want to spear the yarn. I don't want to go down inside the yarn because those fibers will show. I want to go down completely on the other side of the yarn. So this is just the same thing all the way around, where the pattern shows a wider area on the spiral. Yeah, now I got my threads behaving. Just be more gentle, a little softer when you pull your threads through so that they don't compress the yarn too much. Remember to keep working in a fan so that the stitches on the outside sit next to each other. And see, now it's time for me to go a little more towards the end. So I'm going to sort of go on top of that place that I went down before. I need to get my stitches a little more fanned out right here. So I'm going to keep going down almost in the same place. Get them headed more in a fan, more of a circle. And just make sure that as you're working your way around, you don't see any white yarn, or whatever color your yarn is, that you're completely covering it with the thread, the pink threads. So now I will keep stitching again, and I'll show you when we get over to here where it's a little bit narrower. I'll show you what to do with the yarn. All right, I'm at that point where the pattern right here is a little bit narrower. You can see over here it was wider, and so I was very careful not to compress the yarns too much. But in order to get the yarns to fit into that little small area, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Now, as I start to enter that area, I'm actually going to pull on my pink threads a little bit more so that they compress down and fit in the little area of the pattern. Now, I mean, it's not the end of the world if you are not following the pattern exactly. I mean, it's a rose, right? So, but it's nice to give it a little bit of variation so it does look realistic. So it doesn't look like a perfect spiral all the way around. The same width everywhere. Every section of the entire center of the rose is identical, because that doesn't look realistic, right? And you can still see those pinks changing. My favorite part of working with variegated threads. And I'm coming to the end, close to the end of the medium pink thread. So I think here in just a minute I'm going to switch to the dark thread. But I think I'm going to work all the way, let me look. Yeah, all the way to the end of this medium pink thread, so I can capture all of that color. So let me go finish up this thread and I'll show you. We'll just switch to the dark pink thread. I got to the end of the medium pink thread and I wanted to start up now using the darker pink, which is this one. 10061 Threadworks. So you can see how much darker, whoops, come back. You can see how much darker it is compared to that's the medium pink thread right there, and then this is the darker one. So this is the one I was just using, and now I'm using this one. And here's the thing about variegated threads. Sometimes it's light where you want it to be a little bit dark, and sometimes it's too dark where you want it to be a little bit lighter. By that I mean, I just finished the medium pink thread, and you can see it ended on kind of a lighter pink, and the next thread I had pulled up has two ends to it, obviously. One end, let me see if you can see this on here. One end was see over here, it's hard to see, but this end is quite a bit darker than this end. And I decided that when I started back up, I don't want to go from this kind of lighter pink and jump to a very harsh line of super dark, almost red pink. So I chose to make the end that I'm going to start stitching with the lighter pink, so that when it sits next to this color of pink right here, it won't be such a harsh line. I hope that made sense. But that's what I'm talking about when I talk about that variegated threads sometimes need a little bit more thought than just stitching. You just go. You have to think about the colors a little bit sometimes. So now I'm starting in on the darker pink, and it's a little dark, but it's not as super dark as if I had started stitching with the other end of the pink thread. All right, make sure I got it right on the back. Threads always misbehave a little bit when you start because they haven't kind of gotten smoothed down yet. They always behave better after you've done some more stitching. But I'm going to do the same thing now. Where the pattern shows that it's wide, I'm going to let the two pieces of yarn lay down next to each other, and where it's narrower, I'm going to squish them down a little bit and pull the pink thread a little bit more so that it compresses the yarn, and now I'm going to just keep going around doing the same thing I was doing before. I have couched the yarn all the way around now, and if I pull this back, you can see that I'm at the very end of the spiral right here. I just have that little tiny wedge left to go. So before I go any further, I'm going to take each piece of yarn, put it back on the needle. This is the first piece, and I'm going to take it back down through the fabric right there. And then I will take the second piece of yarn and put it back on the needle like this, and do the same thing with it. I'm going to put the needle down almost underneath that first piece of yarn so I can make that sort of angle right there. So I'll see how I'm going to just pull it down. And so now I've got that yarn filling in the rest of that spot. Before I knot it on the back, I'm going to go ahead and finish couching with the dark pink thread. It's a little trickier here because you can't pull the yarn right and left. So you kind of just have to make sure it is out of the way when you put that needle down. And like I said, I don't want to take the pink thread through the yarn. I want to go around it. So all I have to do now is just cover the rest of this yarn, and then this center section is finished. The petals of the roses are a combination of satin stitch and sort of a very simple needle painting technique. Now I can hear those of you out there saying to yourselves, I do not like satin stitch, or I just cannot needle paint. It is so complicated, I don't even want to go there. But I promise, you can do it, and it is fun, and it's not that hard, and I'm going to show you exactly what to do. Okay, so no worries there. You can see that I've already backstitched around the edge of this petal. I used 4 strands of 3822, the lightest color of yellow. I used 4 strands because I really wanted to sort of build up a nice little bit of height right there, so that the edge of the petal would have kind of a raised appearance to it. I am going to start out with 2 strands of DMC 915. This is a color I haven't used yet. This is just a solid color, not a variegated. It's slightly darker than the darkest pink we've used so far, because I want a I want to have a slightly shaded feel, like as if this petal was cupped underneath this section, and it's shaded the closer you get to the center. So let me just show you quickly, hang on, like we did before. We looked at this flower. Just quickly, just sort of a quick overview of what I'm going to do, and then I'll show you me actually doing it. So I'm going to start out with 2 strands of the 915, the darker pink, and I'm just going to make a series of random length straight stitches that all fan towards the center, just like that. And I'm going to make them pretty long, and I'm going to make them pretty close together, because as I continue to stitch out, any stitch that you put down first, and then when you put a thread over it, this color tends to be lessened, reduced a little bit. So I want it to show up, so I'm going to make it a little darker than I think I'm going to want it, because eventually the other colors on top of it will kind of reduce the amount of that dark shade. But I think you can see that they all kind of work in an arc all the way around, different lengths. I'm using 2 strands so that I can get a nice sort of delicate feel. I don't want it to be too thick and, textured. So I'm going to do exactly what I just showed you with the thread now. And as I am coming up under here, as I put my needle down right up next to, I want to make sure that I kind of go in at an angle underneath that way, so I'm getting right underneath that section where I did the couching with the yarn. In other words, I don't want to leave if I go straight down, I might have a little bit of yellow showing through, and I really want to make sure that that dark color thread, that those darker stitches are right up, almost sliding underneath that the center section that's right there. So it's really just a fan of stitches. So I'll stitch that and let you see that, and then we'll come and do the next color. The next color I'm going to add is the Threadworks 10061, the dark variegated pink. And I'm really just going to do the exact same thing as I did with the 915. And you might be thinking, boy, that's a lot of that dark color. And like I said, though, now that I'm going to come put this one in, and I'm going to go in between these stitches, some of this is going to get covered up, and it's going to considerably lighten this just a little bit. You can see on this petal over here, I did the exact same thing. I put a row of the 915, the darkest, and then by the time I got the other 2 colors in, it had lightened up considerably. So anyway, here is the next one. Again, 2 strands. I'm still staying inside of the backstitched edge. I'm not going over that just yet, although I kind of went outside the lines there. And I'm going to come out a little further beyond this feathered edge that I did here. Come out almost to the, sometimes all the way out to the backstitched, that yellow edge that I made. And right now it all looks kind of the same, because the color that is on the variegated thread that I'm using at the moment is really similar to that darker 915, the DMC. So it's a little hard to see any difference. But hopefully you can see that I'm coming up in the fabric here and going down inside between or splitting those previous stitches that I already put down with the 915. Let me zoom in just a little bit more so you can really see what I'm doing. Coming up in the fabric and going down inside the stitches that I put down previously. Same thing again, just vary the length of your stitches so that you get a feathered edge. You can start to see a new color here. A lighter pink is showing up, so it'll show up a little bit more in between those darker, that really, really dark 915. Just like that. So same thing. I'll speed this up, let you see this one, and we'll come back and we'll do the last color of pink. The last step for this petal is the part that I consider to be sort of half satin stitch, half needle painting, because we're still going to be going down in between the stitches we stitched previously, but we're going to pay really close attention to where we come up in the fabric on the outside here, on the outside edge. We're going to make sure our stitches sit very close together, and you can see on this petal over here it gives a nice satiny finish to the edge of that petal. So I am coming up, I've already started a little bit here, I'm coming up just outside, on the outside edge of the back stitch that I did earlier, and I am going down into the previous stitches just like before. And you know, you could either, let me say this, when I'm coming up, bringing my needle up, I'm trying to come up, I don't want to come up, well, let me draw it for you. That's the best way for me to show you. So let's say, well, let's just go back to this petal again right here we've been working on. So let's say, so here's our back stitched edge along here, right? And when I come up, I want to come up, I don't want to come up way outside of that line. I want to come up right underneath that back stitched line. And if at all possible, I'd like to come up at an angle. I'm coming up sort of underneath it and going around it and then back down, so that that thread wraps over the back stitched yellow line. So if I come out way out here in the fabric and go across, I am not really doing that. It's kind of it's a very minor thing, and if you don't really are able to do that, it's not going to be a problem. It's fine. I just am really trying to get almost a rolled edge around this edge of the petal. And if you wanted to, you could come up inside from this direction and go this way and go down. So you could really angle that needle. See how that needle is angled this way instead of going straight down? You could absolutely do that, like this. My brain likes to go from outside edge to inside, and I actually have stitched it both ways. It works, it's fine. So if you're more comfortable starting on the inside and working over the outside edge, do that. That's fine. It'll be good, and you'll probably get a little bit more of a rolled edge, so that's fine. So just like before, I will now work the whole petal, fanning my stitches, being careful where I come up around the edge, and when I'm done, I'll have a petal that looks very similar to this one. I did want to say one other thing, and that is when you're two things really. To just like a satin stitch, like I said, the stitches will be very, very close to each other. You cannot, like I said before, some people that like to do a satin stitch want to put, a stitch here and a stitch here and then fill in between. With variegated threads, you have to work consecutively all the way across, so you can't skip around too much or you'll break up that color. And the other thing you want to remember is that since you're working at a fan, sometimes you'll need to put, like I just put a stitch right there, sometimes you'll need to put this next stitch that comes along kind of underneath the stitch ahead of it to get the angle going right again, going correctly. So if I just kept going like this, I'd end up at the wrong angle over here. So in order to keep my stitches going to fan them out like this, sometimes you have to make a little stitch that goes up underneath the stitch in front of it. But that's really very hidden in all of these other stitches. It's not quite as crucial as if you're working on with a solid color that all has to look really, really perfect. So all of these different threads and colors and variations will hide a lot of that. This rose is finished now, and the last 3 petals, the bottom ones, the ones on the very bottom, were stitched the exact same way as the top 3 petals, the center petals, although these 3 only used 2 colors. I used the DMC 915 and the Threadworks 161, so those 2 dark colors of pink together made up these 3 petals because I wanted them darker because they're underneath the rose, they're behind these top 3 petals, so theoretically the light would be hitting these and it'd be shadowed on the back side there. So that's why those are a little bit different. These 2 petals really just had 2 rows of stitching. One feathered row of the 915, and then the outside edge with the Threadworks, the 161. This petal and this petal were the same. This petal, because it's a little bit deeper, in other words, there's more space from here to here, I actually did 2 rows of the DMC 915 so that dark shadow, that darker pink would create more shadow, so I brought it a little closer to the edge here. So that was sort of like a smallish row, and then another row of the 915, and then the outside edge row of the 161, the Threadworks. So that's the roses. So now it's time to move on to the rose leaves. And you can see that I've already outlined the leaf, just like we did for the petals. I've outlined the leaf in 4 strands of the DMC 3822. The leaves are all satin stitched, except for the back stitch, of course. The colors I'm going to use are the Threadworks 10611. I know all these 1s and 6s and 0s and 11s all sound similar, but this is the color that I call kind of the sagey green. That's that one. And then these lovely dark greens, the 1047. That's going to be the outside of the leaf. And then we're going to do the vein of the leaf with Threadworks 1025, the navy's, the sort of denim blue color. And as I said, this is all satin stitch. Let me show you on the diagram real quickly. I can draw it out faster for you than I can stitch it, but let me just show you here. We're going to start with the inside section of the leaf, and it's going to be we're going to work one side and then the other side, and all of the stitches are going to work at an angle from more towards the tip of the leaf towards the inside, the rose or the base of the leaf. So what I mean by that is I'm just going to go like this. All of that side working at that angle. Then I'm going to hop over to this side and have all of these stitches angle this way. All of the stitches can sit parallel to each other inside that space. And then when it's time for the green, I'll do the exact same thing with the green thread. Start at the base of the leaf, work all of these stitches right up to the sage green ones, and then hop over to this side. And I'll say this right now, at the very tip here, I make 1 stitch. It's exaggerated, but I make 1 stitch that way, and then I start working at an angle all the way down the side, just like this. When I do this outside edge, just like we did on the rose petals, I'm going to come up and over the yellow backstitched line so that satin stitching has a nice raised edge, sort of a padded edge. So that's all the leaves are. You can see here that I've already started one. Let me find my blue thread. Where did it go? And I've worked already this section right here, I'm almost to the end. That's really the end is really the only part that is, I wouldn't even call it difficult really. It's just the stitches get a kind of tiny right here. But just keep them at an angle. The closer I get to the tip of the leaf, sort of I start to begin to straighten them out and almost make a, whoops, and a knot. There we go, right on time. There it is. So I'm going to make one little straight stitch like that, and now I will skip over to this side and start working at the different angle, the opposite angle, if you will. Working those stitches right up to the center vein, the stitches that I already made. So I'll just do this all the way until this side is filled, and then I'll come back and I'll start the green. Here is half of the green thread worked on the left side of this leaf. And I forgot to say a minute ago that for all of these colors I'm using 2 strands, just like I did on the petals, so I can get a nice delicate shading with all this nice variegated thread. And I'm down here at the end, just like on the inside, I will come here to the point of the leaf and make a, might be a little hard to see. I just get straighter and straighter as I get to that I want a nice pointy tip on this because that's what rose leaves look like. So there's my stitch, that's the straight stitch, and now I will proceed with the right side of the leaf, coming up outside the yellow backstitch. And something I also think I forgot to say when I was working on the flower petals is when I'm coming up on the outside here of this yellow backstitch, you do not want to split this stitch. When you come up through it, you want to make sure, hello knot again, you want to make sure that you are not, hang on, not, my thread's gotten all wonky. Not, get it? Haha. You do not want to split this. Can you see that? You do not want to do that. You don't want to split that yellow backstitch. You want to make sure that you're very close to that line, but you are on the outside of it. You are not coming up through that yellow thread. So all there is to do to finish this side is just work the stitches, the satin stitches, all the way down to the base of the leaf. So that's the satin stitch finished on the leaf, and I did want to mention just one thing about the angle of your stitches. The angle of your blue stitching and the angle of your green stitching does not have to match. It's fine. You can, maybe you can tell here that the angle, like particularly on this right hand side, the angle of my blue stitching, the sage green I mean, is sharper, and that the angle on my green stitching is more like this. It doesn't matter. It's just fine. It doesn't matter. What you're really going to want to see is just that pretty thread, those variegated threads, and that the threads are all satiny right next to each other. So anyway, don't worry about the angle of those stitches being the same. For the center vein of the leaf, I'm going to use the blue thread, the navy, the denim threadworks, 2 strands, and I'm going to do the stem stitch. Start at the base. Normally I work stem stitch so that I'm working from left to right, but I just want to keep the leaf the same direction for you. But I'm just going to jump ahead, make a stitch, hold that loop out, and come up inside of it. If I was working left to right, that would mean that this loop would be on the bottom of my line that I was working. Pull it through. Go another, a little hard to get that done in there between all those other stitches. Hold the loop open, come up inside the loop, U shape, pull it. It's really tight because of all that satin stitching is all. I didn't leave any space between them, so I'm really having to push this needle through. Also, I will say that usually I just kind of let the colors of the variegated thread fall wherever they may, but when I'm doing these stems for the leaves, so that they really show up, I try, if I can, I try to find an end of the thread that is pretty dark, because I want to, if I was using part of the thread that was a very medium color blue, it wouldn't really show up very much along here against this sagey green, which has a lot of blue in it, this sort of sagey green thread. So I try to use a dark section of the blue thread, and I think you can see there that it shows up really nicely. So that's the stem stitch for the center stitch, the center vein of the leaf, and that is our rose leaf that is now finished. Next up are the blue flowers, and we're going to work on this one right here. And they are similar to the rose leaves in the sense that they're going to be satin stitch, and they have an inner section, like an inside section, and then an outside section that we're going to work around that inside section. It's a little bit different though, so again, let me quickly show you on here what I mean. So the inside sections, we're going to start with those, and that's going to be the green thread. The same green thread that was on the outside of the leaves. And these inside sections are all going to be straight satin stitches that radiate like that. Now, you'll notice that this section is really narrow, whereas this section up here, the outside edge, is wide. So this is one of those places where you're going to want to, like we were talking about earlier, like stitching in an arc, where all of these points will all sit next to each other, and down here you're going to want to tuck some of these up underneath stitches, because if you try to cram this many stitches into this little tiny space, it's going to all pile on top of each other. You can do it, it would be fine, but this is where you can use the technique of having some stitches be a little bit shorter and tucked up under the longer stitches on this narrow end. So you can see I've worked one of these here. So here is my first stitch. I'm going to work out that way. Now, I'm going to be honest here. Almost always when I work satin stitch, I work like I call it the around and around method, which I know doesn't make sense, but what I'm talking about is I come up on this end and I go down on this end, and then I go underneath the fabric and I come up, down, so that the threads make like a loop. So you get the same long stitch on the back of the fabric, which does use a lot of thread. The bigger your section, the more thread you're going to leave on the back. And normally I only do it that way because I feel like the strands of thread lay down more nicely. They sit next to each other better, and it's just really tedious. The other method that I sometimes use with variegated thread, because A, it's expensive, and B, I don't want to lose any of those subtle gradations of color, is that now, this is sort of my exception to my rule, is that whereas I came up here and went down here, now I will maybe jump right next to my little stitch up here and go down here and come up here. Does that mean, I'm sorry, come up here and go down here, and then up, down, up, down. Does that make sense? So it also worked because this line is jagged. If this was a perfectly straight line, it's much harder to come up and down, go up and down one fiber length apart in a very straight line. So because these are various lengths, the point where you come up and down, so see what I'm doing? I went down here. Now I'm going to come up right next to that. You got to be careful, because sometimes you'll come up on the very same place that you went down and you'll just undo your last stitch. But I want to try to save all of that beautiful shading of the variegated thread, but I would lose half of it if I was leaving some of that thread on the back. And so I'm going to come up. And this is one of those instances where I can come, instead of going all the way down here, I can come a little bit underneath that stitch and go under it right there, which also helps me because now since I want to come back up, I'm not coming up right next to that stitch that I just went down. I'm a little bit away, a little bit of a distance away from it. So of course this little area of green is not really showing any of that beautiful variegation, but that's okay. That's the beauty of it. You never know when it's going to show up or when it's going to change colors. I have a feeling it's going to change color here pretty soon, maybe. But as I finish this sort of triangular shape, maybe a little bit of a darker green will show up there. I'm going to do 2 more stitches. And this one, and then I try to end up so that I'm in the center, so that for the next section, when I hop over, I can start in the center again. So that is my rule-breaking satin stitch for these sections. Like I said, it's pretty daring for me to, whoops, see, that was a section, that was a time where I came right up in the same hole where I went down. So I will redo that stitch and come up in a slightly different place. There, that worked. So anyway, this is my rule-breaking satin stitch area. This is one of the few times that I do not do satin stitch with everything, all the stitches laying the same direction. All right, let me go do all of these, and then we will do the blue outside part of the petals. Just like the rose petals and the leaves, I have outlined the blue flower petals with 4 strands of 3822, the yellow, the light yellow. But I want you to notice that I did not outline the entire petal in some places. I did not put an outline where the petal goes underneath this frame or where it goes underneath this rose petal, because that's not really the edge of the, like this is the edge of the petal here. The edge of the petal is underneath this rose petal, or it's underneath this frame, so I did not want to outline that. So just take note of that. And then what we're going to do to fill in the rest of the blue petal is similar to the leaves. We are going to start in the center and satin stitch over the edge of the yellow backstitching and at an angle, but it's going to work like this. So these stitches get really tiny here at the center. So you're going to work around the edge of the petal, around the green satin stitch that you just finished stitching, and work at an angle, and then you're going to get to this corner and you're going to go this way and slowly start to change that angle so that you're working that way, and then slowly change your angle as you work around that corner, and then work back down this side at an angle till you get to those little teeny tiny stitches right there. And that's all there is to it. Let me show you what that looks like. And like I said, it's really tiny stitches here in the very center, but I'm starting on I'm going to work on this petal right here, so I'm starting on the outside of that yellow backstitching. Pretty steep angle. Sometimes it's, again, just as before, you don't want to split that yellow stitch, and it's sometimes a little tight down in there. So take your time. Hopefully I'm not splitting that yellow thread. And obviously this angle is going to be way different than the green section in the center. That's partly what gives the flower its texture, those different angles. So now as I work up this side, I can make my stitches a little bit longer. Sometimes I even tuck them underneath, just a little bit, the ends of those stitches underneath that green thread. Just to make sure I don't have any yellow fabric showing through. And this blue thread is really pretty because the variations in the color are very pretty. I just am starting to see that lighter blue show up. Still working at that same angle, but along about here, I'm going to start making that angle a little bit sharper, a little bit more angled as I work towards this corner. I'm almost to the corner now, and I'm putting my needle down right at the end of where those green threads went in. This is my corner stitch. Now I can start working across the end, the outside edge of the petal. And this whole end, it's really just like the rose petals you did before, just over that yellow back stitching. Make sure your stitches are close together. Maybe I didn't say this, but 2 strands of the blue, just like all the other colored sections. Alright, so I think you can see this is pretty straightforward. Same as all the other petals. And let me talk about, as I mentioned over here, I did not put the yellow backstitch, but I will obviously stitch, I'll stitch this blue all the way around here, and then these stitches are going to be little teeny tiny stitches in here, and then I'll fan them back out as they go around that petal. So I will show you more of these petals in just a minute when they're done. Alright, the blue petals are all stitched now, and you can see I'm starting on the center. I've done a ring of French knots with the darker gold thread. I believe it's 3852. I used 3 strands and I wrapped the needle twice for each knot. And now I'm working on the inside of the center, and I'm using the lighter yellow 3822. Those are both DMC threads. Again, 3 strands. I'm wrapping the needle twice. I've come up, wrap it twice, and then I will just keep doing that until the center is completely filled. Let me do one more to show you. I'm going to estimate it's going to take maybe 5 French knots to fill that center, but yours may be different. That's fine, just until it looks suitably full. And then I also wanted to mention that for this blue flower here, the one that's in profile, whereas we saw the top of this one's in profile, it's essentially the same thing, except that instead of satin, just straight satin stitch for the green areas, I really just did just a long and short stitch, just random length stitches. Let me kind of show you on here again. So instead of like up here, we did just straight stitches next to each other. Right here, I just filled in kind of random lengths. Since these are kind of unusual shapes, they're kind of a curve. Just fill in like that, all with the green. Same thing here in the center section, just fill that in, little stitches along there. And then I will do the petals just exactly like I did them up here. So these 2 petals are really just the same. Start in near the center, work at an angle, get up to that corner, go around the corner. These are just regular old satin stitches, just like the other petals. Turn that corner, go down. And then this one is, there's really not a corner to turn, so they'll all just be straight satin stitches. And of course you will outline these petals with the yellow thread with 4 strands of yellow thread in the back stitch, just like the other petals, even though I haven't done that yet. So that's how to do that one. And then when it comes time to do the stem, again, get your green thread and just fill in with random lengths of stitches like that until it's filled in. So that's really straightforward. And you don't even have any French knots to worry about for that one. So yay for that if you don't like French knots. Okay. Those are the blue flowers. I'll finish up this center and we'll move on to the next element. Next up, we're going to work on these, they're maybe ferns, you know, maybe they're kind of like a lamb's ear. In my mind, I envision them as kind of fuzzy, and they're kind of that sagey green color because I am using the Threadworks 10611 in that beautiful kind of sage green color. So that's the color of a lamb's ear. If you know what that is, it's a really interesting plant, but I think I might have called them ferns on the pattern. Either way, whatever they're called, this is what we're going to work on. You can see that I've turned the hoop a little bit so that it's facing straight down. I like to work on this one so that it's coming straight at me, but that's just preference. And let me show you how we're going to stitch this one. This one is going to be very similar again to the rose leaves, all satin stitch except for the center vein. And but at an angle, I am not going to outline the edge with the yellow backstitch because it's just super curvy and the stitches would have to be so tiny and it would just take forever. And this one is fine. These are kind of, they don't need that much texture on the edge and it would just be pretty tedious. You can if you want to. It always gives a nice edge to satin stitch over the back stitching, but I didn't want to do that. Would have taken forever, so I just wanted to hop right into the fun satin stitch. So here is how we're going to stitch those. I always start, for some reason I work left, I work counterclockwise, left and around and to the side, back to the other end, and just straight stitches, shorter as they get to those little sections, and then hop out and make a long one, and then short ones, long ones, short ones. And if they're at an angle obviously to the center vein, and if you want help figuring out the angle you want to stitch, just envision a line running straight down the middle of one of these little curvy leafy bits. That's the angle you can stitch as you go around. So like this one would be straight, this angle, and then as you go around you're going to make that angle, and that will allow you to have all these stitches line up as you go, just like that. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like as I am stitching. Really just straight ahead satin stitching. You don't have to worry about stitching in an arc or fanning out your stitches like some areas, like the petals, because all of these stitches are generally, well, I take that back. You will need to a little bit here on this end as you round this corner to switch from this angle and go around to that angle. But really all of these leaves are just stitches that sit right next to each other. I'm making sure that as I work the stitches that go right up to underneath this blue petal, I don't want to leave any yellow fabric showing between my stitches because I want it to look like that fern or that lamb's ear, whatever we want to call it, goes up underneath, or not up underneath, but goes underneath the blue flower. So now you can see that I am at the little short section, the section that's these little shorter stitches, but they're still going next to each other at an angle. So after I do that little short stitch, now you can see to hop out here, I'm going to hop out and make a long stitch, but it is still sitting parallel to that little short stitch right there. And as I keep doing these stitches next to each other, it'll form that little leafy thing, little part of the fern that curves out like that. Now I'm back to doing the short section. Still working at that same angle, still everything's parallel. And now it's time to hop back out and do a longer stitch along the side of that part of the leaf. Jump out a little bit more. Do the center stitch of that little part of the leaf. Well, maybe this is the center one. So I think you can see that's all that is. Let me work my way down to the tip. It's really just very similar to working the tip of the rose leaf that we did earlier, where you just sort of gradually work your stitches, change the angle as you go around the tip of the leaf. We are going to stitch a center vein down the center, so you know, I did a pretty good job of keeping that straight right there. It's kind of ragged right there, but that's fine. It will be covered up. So you don't have to stress too much about how perfectly straight this line is right there. I'm almost to the rounded end of this little leaf. So now I'm going to very gradually, each of my stitches, start making them angle. They were like this, and I'm going to gradually make them angle around till this one's straight, and then I will keep rounding the bend, so to speak. Now is the only time on this leaf that I might need to tuck a stitch underneath the previous one. Maybe right there I did a little bit. And since you don't have an outline, a backstitched outline that you are stitching over, you will, want to be careful about where you come up right here on the outside edge so that that edge is nice and, the stitches sit next to each other. I have kind of come inside my outline right there, but that's okay. Probably if I was being picky, I would take those stitches out and make sure that I covered that line, but it'll be all right. That's one of those let it go moments, right? And now you can see I've rounded the tip, and now I'm back to working on this side, so all my stitches will be at an angle all the way to the end there. For the center vein of this leaf, we're going to do the exact same thing we did on the rose leaves and do a stem stitch with the green thread. Just exactly the same. And this one I don't really worry so much about trying to find a dark section of green like I did on, let me see, where was I trying to do? Find the dark section, wherever. Anyway, I just let the colors fall where they may. On this one, as I work the center vein all the way to the end. I think one more stitch, and that one's done. The last flower to complete is this little flower bud right here, and it uses what I call the pearly leaf stitch. Now, even though this is a flower bud, I used it on a previous pattern for a little green leaf bud, but it's really simple and it gives you this very nice kind of raised sort of pearl-like appearance. And so I have 3 strands of the DMC 3822. And you're going to want to come up on one side and make a little angled stitch that goes down right at the point where that bud meets the stem. Then come over to the other side and do the exact, make a mirror stitch and go right down into the same hole there by the stem. Then come over to the other side, make another, move up around the shape a little bit and come up and make another angled stitch that goes down in the exact same hole near the stem. Make a mirror stitch on the other side, down in the same hole. And just keep working the entire bud until it is filled like that. I'm going back and forth, side to side, always going down in the same hole. And then eventually you will get to where you have one last stitch to make, and that is the very center stitch that will go right down the center of the little bud. And I make that one the last one because I want the center point to be the highest spot on that bud. And go right down the center. And sometimes to get the threads to sort of all cooperate and be smooth, I'll take my fingernail and sort of scrape them over like that, and that kind of gets them to sort of smooth down. Let me show you that one more time over here. So start on one side, go at an angle, down at the stem, mirror stitch on the other side. Keep doing that until it's filled. And the ones I'm working on here are just a teensy bit larger, so they're taking a few more stitches to completely fill. There's some on the other parts of the pattern that are smaller than this, so they won't take this many stitches to fill. And sometimes, you know, they're not exactly symmetrical. That's all right. So this one I'm going to do one last, that one took fewer stitches. I'm going to do one last stitch right down the center, like that. Smooth it out. And then to give it a little bit of shading, I'm going to use 2 strands of DMC 3852 and give each of these a little bit of, just a little bit of a darker shade at the bottom. So I'm coming up through the center and going down in that same hole by the stem. And I'm going to make a little stitch on one side of that, down in the same hole. Same thing on the other side. And these are just little tiny stitches, just to give a little bit of shading. Oops, my needle came unthreaded. Hang on a minute, let me quickly rethread that. All right, there we go. All right. And I'm going down. And then one stitch on one side of that, and one stitch on the other side that's just slightly shorter. Although these are really tiny stitches. Same thing on this one. That one was a little off center. One more teensy tiny stitch. Just like that. The only thing left to do for this is to make the stem of these little buds with the green thread and the stem stitch, which is an obvious choice, right? All right, next up we will start working on the word and the frame. Let's talk just briefly about the stem stitch. The stem stitch is a really versatile, really good basic stitch that's wonderful to know. Obviously it works well on stems, but that's because it's good for curves. It's also great for straight lines, but it's beautiful on curves, whether they're long, gentle curves or much tighter curves. So the very basic stem stitch is to if you're right-handed, you're going to work left to right, come up, hold the working thread below the line, go down a stitch length and come up in between, inside that stitch, and pull. And then go down a stitch length, hold that U, that if you want to think of it like a U of thread, but hold it down below the line you're stitching, come back up and work those stitches all the way across exactly the same way. So you can see it's very simple. Again, if you're right-handed, always work left to right, holding the thread below the line, and that's important when you start going in different directions. And let me explain what I mean. Now, let me briefly say, if you are left-handed, let's say if you are left-handed and you're working from right to left, you would hold the working thread above your line. So if I'm working from here to here, I would hold it above. But since I'm right-handed, I'm working left to right, hold the thread below, that way. When it comes time to end the line, just go down. So now let's just say if I wanted to work this vertical line. I can always turn the hoop, and if it confuses you about where to hold the thread above or below, especially as you're working more and more curves, sometimes it's easier just to turn the hoop so that you always have the line horizontal like this and you're always working left to right. That works great too. But if you don't want to turn the hoop for whatever reason and you want to work a vertical line or curve, just always think of this being left to right. So now I would hold the working thread on that side and work down that way. See how that works? So that's really the basic stem stitch, and we are going to be using it as both a single line stitch and a filling stitch on the word you have chosen. So let's go look at that. So here's the word I've chosen, breathe, and you can see I've already started working on it, and here is where I used the stem stitch as a single line. And then for the wider sections of the letters, each letter, I'm going to be basically stacking rows of stem stitch. And when I'm working on writing, I like to stitch it in the way you would write it. So when you see over here, I started right here. This is like if I was going to write the word B, I would start here and go around and come down. So I worked this whole line, and then I skipped and came over here and came back up so that this wider section of the B looks like it's laying on top of this line. Because if you wrote this, you wouldn't have this line laying on top of the downstroke of the B. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. Like if you were going to write it in a texture, you know, obviously it says textured, and so I want that line back there to look like it's behind this section. So same thing here. I made this line, came around, and I made this line, and I actually stopped, and then I worked on this part, and then I started the R. Speaking of the R, you can see this little bitty round, the little loop at the top of the R. That is all stem stitches, just really, really tiny stem stitches. For the stem stitches for the majority of the lines and these wide sections, they're probably, I'd say each stitch is maybe not quite as short as an eighth of an inch. You don't want to get super, super long stem stitches because they'll be kind of, they won't be as compacted, and you really want to fill these wide sections in. You don't want any of the yellow fabric showing through. But the general rule with curves and stem stitch is that the tighter the curve, the smaller the stitch. So up here, everything's about the same, and then when I got up to here, I made each stitch as I went around this tight curve right up here, I made it shorter. Same thing at the top of the B, same thing down here, and obviously this little loop. So I mean, I went right here, and then I went all the way around, little tiny, that's probably 1, 2, 3, probably 4 stitches right there, and then one more. So just keep that in mind. So I've already done the R. I'm going to start this E, and you can see this E might be a little tricky because I'm going to start with the wide section, and I have this little bitty, it curves over right here. So I am going to keep my hoop like this so that I'm always working like this. And this is when I was talking about when you have to change the direction of your stem stitches. If I wanted to, I could always turn my hoop so that this E was facing that way, and so I was working more left to right instead of, vertically, but I'm going to show it to you this way. So I'm going to start up here, and for the wide sections, I will do one long row until I get to the bottom of the wide section, and then I'll come back up and I'll work another row right up against that row, and then another row, and then however many rows it takes me to fill this section. So I'm starting up here, and so since this is sort of a curve, I'm going to pretend like this is my left side and this is my right side. I know that doesn't make sense because technically this is right and left, but if I was working this left to right, this would be considered my left, and I'm working that way. So I'm going to keep my thread above the line, and because this is a little tiny small curve right here, I'm going to make a very small stitch and pull it, and then another very small stitch, maybe a little bit bigger, but still pretty small. And now that I'm going on this kind of more gentle curve, I can make my stitches just a teensy bit bigger, but I'm still keeping that thread, that working thread, to the left of my stitching. Like that. Let me get down to the bottom of this curve. Now I'm going to make one small stitch, and then I'm going to stop here. Actually, you know what I'm going to, I'm going to stop right here. So I'm going to put my thread down. So there's my first row of stem stitching. Now I'm going to hop back up here. You could start and now work from the bottom to the top, and then the top to the bottom, and the bottom to the top. I am going to just jump that thread all the way back up to the top because it's white thread and it's not going to show behind there, particularly since it's going to have stitching on top of it, and just do the same exact thing. I am making sure I'm doing just another row of stem stitching right up against that first row. I'm going to make sure that it is really close to it so none of the fabric shows through. Come up between. And stem stitch, for some reason, is one of those stitches where your thread really benefits from being untwisted while of letting it hang so that it untwists while you're stitching, because it just, I think it has to do with because you're constantly changing directions of the stitching when you're pulling it in and out. Something about it, it gets real, the strands get kind of almost felted together. So sometimes I will stop and run my fingers down the strands of thread so they kind of lay back flat again. So now I'll come back up, do another little tiny stitch for that small curve up there. And I have found that it takes me, I forgot to say, I'm using 3 strands of white thread. And it takes me about 4 rows to fill the letters that I traced. That was 3 rows, and I think you can see I have maybe just a little bit of space to fill in right here. because that's looking a little bit narrow, especially compared to the R and the B. So instead, I'm not going to come all the way back up here to the top because that little area right there is filled. I am going to start my stitching right here. I think you can see that. So I'm going to, so now, whereas before I did maybe, I don't know, what was it, 6 or 7 stitches? Now I'm probably just going to do maybe, let's see, there's 1, 2, was that 2? Anyway, whatever. And so now, again, I'm not going to come all the way back down to here. Actually, I am, because I want to make that line that goes up to the A. And I haven't, oh, nope, I thought it was a knot. So now I'm actually going to go down right in there, changing my mind as I go here, so that that stitch is sort of pressed up against there, and now I can come over here, start again. Now I really am working left to right, and make that line going up to the A. One more stitch, and I'll stop there. And you can see that I still have this line to do here. And honestly, I probably should have, I realize now when I did my first row of stem stitch, I should have started here, gone all the way around and made that first row and then filled in. But I forgot. So now I'm just gonna fill that in. A couple of small stitches. Hopefully no one will ever know that I should have stitched that earlier, and I will just tuck that last stitch right into there. See? All worked out. Okay, and that's the E. Same thing for all the letters. The A is real similar to the E because it starts, so I'm going to just start over here, work down, and then fill in, and then fill this one in, keep going, and then the very last line that I will do would be the cross, where you cross the T right there, because that, if you were writing it, that would be the last thing you would do. You'd write everything and then you'd come back and you'd cross the T. So this stitching will be, so I'll do this whole wide area of the T and the H and the E, and then I will come back and I'll put one long row of stitching right on top of those letters. So that is how to do the letters. This is really fun and is I really like this sort of textural, but it still fills in. It's a really great stitch to fill in lettering. The frame for the word is made up of 2 borders, an outside border and an inside border. And the outside border is created by using a stitch called the looped running stitch. Now this was a new stitch to me before I started this design, and I was looking for something that would give me a little lacy edge, like a little picot edge, if you know what that is. Picot is usually like a little bitty loop that hangs off the edge. And this stitch ended up being perfect, and it's really simple. It looks like it would be complicated, but it's really quite simple. So the first thing to do is to stitch a running stitch across your line. A running stitch is the most basic of stitches. It's just in and out and in and out, up, down, up, down. For the spacing, I want each of your stitches, you need each of your stitches to be about 1/8 of an inch long, with about 1/8 of an inch in between. You don't have to get a ruler out or anything, it's fine. It's just that where your running stitches are placed will impact how big your loops are, or how far apart the loops are. And I do want you to start each, or to complete each section of the frame as a separate section. So in other words, don't start stitching up here and make the corner and keep going. I want this to be a section, and then make this a section, and then this section over here, and this section up here. So do each section separately for both the outside and inside border, and we'll talk about the inside border in just a minute. So I've already stitched this running stitch here. The one other thing to remember is to always start your first stitch so that it begins right at the corner, whether it's this line going this way or this line going this way. This has a stitch that starts right in the corner and makes one little stitch. So now that your running stitch is in place, you are going to come, oh, sorry, forgot to mention, I'm using 2 strands of white DMC, both for the running stitch and for the looped section of it that we're going to do right now. So I'm going to come up right at the edge of that stitch. I work left to right. All right, now you're going to bring that thread up. You're going to go underneath the running stitch right next, like in other words, if I came up over here, I'm going to go over to the second running stitch, go through that. I am not going to pull the thread all the way through. Then I'm going to come under, not into the fabric, but under the stitch and on top of, see that, how the needle goes on top of that thread? Pull that, and now here is where you need just a little bit of patience. Okay, so before I start pulling this all the way, this thread under here is going to create my loop. So what I like to do is I like to sort of put my needle down, and I'm going to pull the thread that I just now put underneath that running stitch. So I'm going to hold that down. I'm going to pull until that gets tight. So I've kind of stuck the tip of my needle down into the fabric, and I'm going to pull up. So you can see if I stuck my needle down here, that's how big my loop is going to be. But I don't want my loop that big. I want it to be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to put it right there. I'm going to pull straight up. Now I'm ready to come across to the next running stitch and do the exact same thing. I'm going to go under that stitch. I'm going to jump back to the previous running stitch, put the needle under that, be right next to that loop. Make sure that I'm going over that thread. Pull it through just a little bit, get where you can see it. And then this thread that I just put under, I'm going to hold my needle in place and pull up. Just pull slowly. And you can see that that forms the second loop. Now, this is not a stitch to do when you're in a super hurry or you're like really angry about something, because it needs a little bit of patience. And you can't pull too hard because you'll just pull those loops right out of existence. So I've gone under the next running stitch, under the other direction. I've gone under the stitch to the left of it, over that stitch. Now I will put my needle down. Let me see, get this so you can see it better. Put my needle down into the fabric, pull up, and that will pull that thread straight. And those strands have kind of gotten a little bit uneven. There it goes. All right. So put my needle down, pull up till I have the loop the same length. A lot of times I'll kind of go back, and sometimes if I pull too hard, you'll pull the second loop or the previous loop sort of too flat. So you just kind of keep pulling it down. Make sure each loop is the same size. Oops, go down underneath that stitch, the next running stitch, under the previous one. Put my needle down to hold that in place and pull until the next loop forms. Down this direction, under the next running stitch, up under the previous running stitch, put my needle in place and pull until I form a loop. Do that all the way across. Do one more to show you. That one got a little flat, so I'm going to go pull it out just a little bit. And let me work across. I also forgot to mention a little bit when you like the petals that are the flowers that look like they go underneath this frame over here. You're just going to do your running stitch all the way across, just right up, snug those right up next to those stitches. But then I stopped here because the frame goes behind the rose here. You can see that way over in the corner. So let me work across until I get to this flower over here. When you get over to the little looped running stitch that falls on top of this blue flower, you do the exact same thing. You just, it takes a little bit more patience because you have to get under that thread, that white thread, without getting underneath the blue stitches. So you kind of work it just a little bit. But same thing. Now I've just gone under that running stitch and I'll go back up. It's just that it's a little bit tighter quarters because you've got to work around all those previous stitches. And I did want to mention too, as you're working across, right here when you're holding your needle here and you're pulling this thread, make sure you pull this thread tightly enough that it flattens out the thread that runs across the top here. If you don't tighten it enough, you'll end up with kind of a loose, sort of a wavy, scalloped edge on top. And you really want it to be flat on the top, but looped on the bottom. So when you come to this point right here where you're holding this loop and you're pulling this across, just pull this thread tightly enough. I'll show that again. Get under that. That's hard to do. Try to get under the white, but not any of the blue. This one's a little bit easier because it's going up and not down. All right, so I'm going to hold my needle in place and pull that thread. I'm going to pull it hard enough that I keep pulling. And the previous loop should sort of stay in place, but if you need to go back and kind of open it back up, but same thing, I'm going to put my needle back in place and pull that thread tightly enough to make sure that it's flat on top. All right, I'll keep working across here until I get to the rose, and then I'll just put my needle down into the fabric, and then that section of the border will be finished. The inside border of the frame is a very simple line of thread that is couched. Now I know when we were working on the centers of the flowers up here, we did, I think I called it extreme couching. This is just simple couching and it's really easy. I am going to use, it does use 2 threads so it looks sort of impressive, but it's simple. I'm going to use all 6 strands of DMC white, and then I have another needle threaded that has 1 strand. If you only own 1 needle, that's fine. First thing to do is to thread the 6 strands onto your needle. Come up. I have a knot in the end. Come up right on the corner, like that. Pull that thread through, and then you're going to lay it on the fabric. And then for a while here, for this whole time, you will not even need this needle that this has been threaded on. You could just take that off and let that thread hang. But if you have 2 needles, you can leave that needle on, that's fine. But either way, now I have 1 strand, and now I've got that 6 strands, that length of 6 strands of white, and now I'm just going to come along here and right on the line, I'm going to pull the 6 strands out of the way, come up with the 1 strand, and then go over on the other side, right where I came up, and I'm just going to capture that 6 strands with the 1 strand. And that's couching. So I'm going to jump ahead about, for a straight line like this, where you don't have any curves or corners or anything, you don't have to couch really close together, although I wouldn't go 2 inches in between couching. I like to stay about maybe 1/4 of an inch at the most, and I tend to pull it out of the way get my hand out of the way, pull it out of the way on one side so I can see the line and come up, and then pull it out of the way the other way so I can go down where I came up on the other side, and then pull it tight. And each time I am pulling the one strand, I'm also taking the 6 strands and I'm tugging on it just a little bit so that it stays nice and straight as I'm making each couching stitch. And so that is all there is to couching this inside line of the border. And so when you get across to the end over here, move this over a little bit so you can see. When I come across to here, after I've couched this whole thing, I don't put the needle, when you get over there, after you've couched all the way across, take your needle again. If you need to rethread your thread on the needle, that's fine. And then you will go down right at the end of that line and pull it. I don't do that first because I like to have this where I can manipulate it. So I wouldn't put it down right now. I'm going to couch it all the way across, put it down, put in one last couching stitch, and then I will knot both of those threads on the back of the work. And that's couching. There is only one thing left to do to finish the stitching on this design, and that is to put a French knot on the lower left corner and in the upper right corner. The other two corners do not need anything because they're covered up by flowers. But I'm using 2 strands of the DMC white thread, and to make this French knot I'm just going to come up, wrap the needle 1, 2, 3 times, go back down, and there you go. Now it has a nice little finished point on it. And now we are completely finished with the stitching. For display, you can absolutely leave this stitching in the hoop. It's obviously sized to fit inside a 9-inch hoop, and if you want to put it on your wall like that, or put it on a tabletop or whatever, you can absolutely leave it in the 9-inch hoop. But I thought I'd do something a little bit different because not everybody likes to have a hoop, leave their stitching in a hoop. So I'm going to show you how to mount this stitching onto a backing so that you can put it in a frame. This is sized for 8 by 10. This is an 8 by 10 piece of foam board or foam core. It's very lightweight, but it's rigid. And the only other thing you'll need is your needle and 3 to 6 strands of any color of thread. I'm using the dark here just so it's easier for you to see, but it doesn't really matter because it's all going to be on the back. I have taken the stitching out of the hoop, obviously, and I very carefully ironed around the edge. I did not press any of the stitching. I was very careful. I put a press cloth down and made sure I did not touch any of the stitching because I don't want to press that down. I also did not wet the fabric to get out the hoop line, the marks from the hoop, because as I've mentioned before in the pattern, the ThreadWorks threads, all these variegated threads, are hand dyed and those colors will run. So do not, under any circumstances, either dip this in water or run it under water or spray water on it if you're trying to get those hoop marks out. Just use a dry iron because you do not, obviously at this point, want all of these colors to run. That would be disastrous, right? So dry iron. So I've done that. I have also, you don't have to do this, but if you want to, it's kind of helpful. I marked where I wanted the 8 by 10 and where I wanted this to sit inside the 8 by 10 shape, and I marked it on my fabric, and I did just one strand of white DMC thread and did a quick running stitch, and I did white because I just didn't want any dyes of any type of anything as I pressed it to get into my fabric. So that's just that can stay because I don't think it will show by the time I wrap this fabric around the backing. But if it does, you can always just take it out because it's just a big, humongous, long running stitch. So that is my pressed cloth. So here's my foam board. What you're going to do is place this down. Now, if you want to, you can cut a piece of felt that is 8 by 10 and you can just put a very light application of thin application of like just some white tacky glue or white Elmer's glue, and you can glue a piece of felt onto here if you want to give it just a little bit of padding. I have definitely done that in the past. For this one, this foam board is a nice white color. If you were using some sort of rigid cardboard that was not white, you would want it white, so I would definitely glue some white felt onto your backing. But since this is already white, I'm just going to use it as is. So I'm going to place my stitching face down. This is also where it will help me to have my stitching because I can see it on the back or the front. And I'm going to lay the 8x10 foam board, line it up with my stitching. Now make sure that whatever surface you're working on is clean underneath here because you don't want your stitching to get dirty because you're going to be working with it a lot and moving it around. Also make sure your hands are clean because you're going to be handling this fabric a lot. You don't want to get it soiled. So make sure your surface is clean under here. But anyway, now I have placed the foam board inside the 8x10 outline that I stitched. I am going to take this is 3 strands of thread. Like I said, 2 strands might be, you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on this thread and you want it to be strong. So I would not use any fewer than 3. So I'd use 3, 4, or 6, whatever. You're going to start with the corners. So I have a pretty big knot in here because I don't want it to pull through. And I'm going to fold this up at a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to put my needle in like this. And I'm going to come across and I'm going to fold this corner over at a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to put the needle and thread through like that. And I am going to gently pull. Now, for the whole rest of this, you kind of have to sort of work it so that it doesn't shift too much on you. But I'm going to pull here. I'm going to pull like this. And I could pull on this super, super hard. But I don't want to because it will stretch this fabric so far out of alignment and it might even like punch a hole. And this foam board is not sharp on the corners, but I still don't want to get the fabric distorted. So I'm going to just sort of gently pull like that, come back across, and just make a stitch like that, and just make sure that those corners, I'm going to sort of realign my board again, make sure it's in line with my outline. Just go like that so that it's kind of a slight tug on the fabric right there. And I'm going to just make a sort of a tacking stitch to hold that in place. Maybe make one more. And I'm going to trim that thread. Then I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other side. And I'll try to use this thread even though I won't be able to loop back, fold it back over again. I'll just do one. So anyway, I'm going to make sure my board is lined up again. Fold that corner up at a 45-degree angle. Come to this one, fold it over, come through that way, and pull these corners. And it looks very wonky right now, I know, and you're like, this is driving me crazy. It's going all over the place. Just have to work with it a little bit. So I'm pulling on that one, and I'm going to, let's see, I maybe have just enough thread to come back over here. Hold that tight and make a, oops, and of course, I'll just tie a knot right there. I just need that thread to just stay in place like that. There's not going to be a whole lot of tension on the corners because we're about to do the long sides and the short side. So there's that. Trim that off. All right, now let me go make up another to work on the sides. It doesn't matter if you start on the long side or the short side, but I'm going to start on the long side because it's just sitting here like this. I am going to rethread my needle with a very long piece of thread. I will figure it out here in a minute. I mean, it's going to be at least 48 inches long. And you can add more if you need to, but I'm just going to start there. So let me go thread that needle and I'll show you what we're going to do with that next. All right, I have my really long piece of DMC thread, and I'm actually using 6 strands for this part because this is the part that's going to have a lot of strain on it. So 4 would probably be fine, 3 would probably be fine, but I'm using 6 here. And so I'm going to start in the center of the top. I'm going to put that long thread through, and really this is just a lacing technique. I'm going to come down, straight down to the center of the bottom. Now I'm just going to work from the center over to one side. Doesn't matter if you go left or right first, but just start in the center. And here's the part where you're going to pull the fabric tight. I know the corners seemed like they were really loose, and they were because I didn't want to stretch that fabric out too much, but here's the part where you want to put a lot of stretch, a lot of pull on that fabric. So I'm going to just go back and forth, kind of like lacing a corset, you know. And I'm going to pull it tight as I go, and I can I can always come back and, in fact, I will need to come back and tighten it before I knot it. So I'm going to just quickly get these lacing stitches in here. And this is why you need so much thread, because you use a lot of it. So you can see. So now I can't just pull here because these are still loose. So I have to pull from here and then pull this one and then this one and pull all the way down, pull across each one that I've gone back and forth. So now those are pretty tight. Still gonna go back and forth. Like this. And I am going to go all the way, well, as far as I can go. I'm out of thread now, so I will need to get some more thread here. So I'm at the end of this thread. So, but before I tie it off, because I do want to continue, I want to go all the way across to that folded edge and this folded edge, and I'm a little bit short. So I'm going to make sure that these are as tight as I can get them. So I'm going to start back here again, pull that as tight as it'll, and I pulled my knot through. Okay, well, I'm just going to start over because, see, I did not tie a big enough knot right here, and I just yanked it right through that fabric. So let me just start over completely with a huge knot that will not pull through. Okay, I'm back now. I rethreaded my needle and put a huge knot in the end, and I have laced my way back from, again, from the center to the left. And I have been working it. I've gotten to this point, and I am continually pulling on each one from the top and the bottom. And each time I pulled, I could get like a whole nother inch stretched out of it. As I'm pulling, I will occasionally hold it tight and flip it over and make sure that, now this section is still loose, obviously, because that's where I haven't done any lacing yet. But this section right through here is tight. It also has not been stretched this way, so that's going to be tighter. But for right now, I'm just paying attention to from about here to here, because this is the part that I have pulled the fabric. I'm paying attention to my edges to make sure that I'm kind of staying on the line that I sewed earlier with my running stitch. And so I'm going to continue to make sure that I haven't lost any. It really takes some strength. You really got to keep working it. And it's easy for it to get loose here at the working end. So I'm going to sort of hold the tightness in there. And I'm going to, now that I have all of these as tight as I want them, I'm going to try to hold that really tightly while I put the last section in. See if I can get. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is when you are putting your needle in the edge of the fabric, you don't want to put it too close to this edge, because in fact I put it too close right there. I want to come back minimum half an inch, but more like 3/4 of an inch or even an inch up into this fabric, because you're pulling on it so hard and it is stretching those fibers, and you don't want the fabric to just, the thread to just pull through this raw edge of the fabric. Because I did it a little bit close right there. Maybe it'll hold for me. Maybe I can get one more down here. Really should have cut that thread longer. So now I am down here, and now I'm going to hold all of these. In fact, I'm going to give them one more tug. You can see I can still get a little bit more tightness out of it. So that's as tight as I can get it. And I'm going to, just like I did on the corners here, you can see I just folded that fabric right over that corner fabric, so that's covered up. So now I'm going to hold that as tight as I can keep it. Try my hardest to keep it tight while I sew just a couple of stitches to anchor that so that that does not loosen. It's not pretty on the back, but it's doing its job, right? Alright, so there's my, like that. Now I can rethread my needle, and I will come and I will start right here, and I will work across to this side. I'm working across to this side, and I wanted to tell you that when you get over here into this fabric that's over this corner and that's been folded over itself, when you're putting your needle in, you don't want to grab there's like 3 layers right here. There's the 2 layers that are folded over here, and then there's the layer that's the corner layer. Definitely do not grab this corner layer, because you just want it to lay under there where it is. So when you're coming up here to put your needle in, really just put it in the top layer to run your needle through, because that's really what the main section you're trying to pull on. Same thing down here. Only slip it into this top layer. But I am now ready to give this half a good strong tighten. You know, go all the way across, pulling all of these strings, so that these threads, so that they're as tight as they can be, and then knotting this off. One other thing, or another thing to watch out for, is as you're going across tightening these, you might be pulling one side more than the other side, and that's what's happening here. I don't know if you can see this, but if you can see my white, the line that I stitched for my 8x10 outline, this one has started to get pulled to the back, and this one on this side is not pulled as much, and that's going to distort the front. And if it was just flowers, it wouldn't matter that much, but because we have a nice frame, the border of around the word, and I want to keep it as straight as possible, I don't want it to be a curved line, I'm going to work just a little bit to loosen it up here and tighten it down here so that that line on the front is not distorted. So I will kind of work this a little bit. I'm going to try to loosen it right here and get that stitching line to my guideline that I had, and I'm going to pull it more down here on the bottom. It's a little bit tricky. You really just have to kind of be patient and pull it. Just keep pulling the strings. So now I'm pulling the bottom side more than I am the top. I'll pull this next one more from the bottom. And I'm looking at my stitching line down here to see if I can pull it a little bit more and release some of the tension up here at the top. Now I'm going to pull this one again over here on the bottom some more. I'm going to pull that near the bottom side. Hopefully that has fixed that problem just a little bit, but I'll keep working on that. And this side will be finished, and then we can move on to the short sides. And here it is. It's all stretched onto the board now. Here's what it looks like on the back, and like I said, it's not pretty, but it's not the back that matters, right? It's the front. And I think this looks really nice. You can see it's stretched real tightly. There's no wrinkles left. I did a pretty good job of staying in line with my stitching. It's a little bit wavy, but that's okay because it looks all right. So thank you so much for joining me on this tutorial for the One Meaningful Word number 4 pattern, and I hope you have a wonderful time making this design. See you next time.